Mjolnir. Whosoever holds this hammer, if he be worthy, shall possess the power of Thor. But who other than the Odin son himself would be worthy of such grand cosmic might? Steve Rogers? Jane Foster? Or maybe a horseman from space? This is Beta Ray Bill, and while everything about him might read like a parody at first glance, he isn't. Beta Ray Bill is not a joke character and never has been. Instead, this guy is genuinely, unironically amazing. In fact, Beta Ray Bill might be one of the best cult classic characters in all of Marvel. So who is Beta Ray Bill? Where did he come from? Why can this cyborg horse alien wield the might of Mjolnir, and what does he do with that incredible power? All these questions and more are going to be answered in today's video. No need to drag this intro out any longer. At this point, you've already heard the pitch and are either intrigued or not. So for those of you who are intrigued, I'll go ahead and start giving you the context. To understand Beta Ray Bill, we first have to understand Mjolnir, so that's how this video is going to begin, but in a kind of specific way. I think all of us probably have a rough understanding of Mjolnir at a foundational level. It is Thor's cool hammer, it has lightning powers, it comes back if you throw it, and then of course there's the whole worthiness thing. That is all accurate, but if we're talking about the deep lore of the comics, there's more. A lot more. Mjolnir has been in literally thousands of comics, and its status quo has changed many times over the decades. If I told you everything about how Mjolnir works, I'd be here for an hour. But it is very important to understanding Beta Ray Bill, so what am I gonna do here? Well, there's fortunately an easy solution. Yes, understanding how the hammer works is vital to understanding Bill. But Bill is connected to the hammer as it stood from the 1960s to the 1980s, much of which is incredibly outdated now. So I'm going to begin the video with a crash course on Mjolnir, but Mjolnir as it worked about 50 years ago. This first thing is relatively common knowledge among comic fans at least, but when the Marvel version of Thor first debuted in 1962, he had a secret identity. Thor lived on Earth among humans as Dr. Donald Blake. Dr. Blake was not a title that he held willingly, though. Thor in his base form was more or less as you know him, son of Odin and Prince of Asgard, powerful but arrogant, and when his arrogance got him into enough trouble, Odin decided that his son needed to learn humility and sent him to Earth. An important thing to note here, though, is that Donald Blake did not know his true nature at first. Odin removed all of his memory of Asgard and made his son think that he had always been a normal human man. The idea here being not just that Thor needed to learn humility, but that he would literally have to experience life as someone he saw as beneath him. Mjolnir was sent to Earth as well, but not alongside Thor. Thor ended up in New York City, but Odin just kinda chucked Mjolnir at Norway for some reason, where it ended up in a cave disguised as a regular stick. Fate eventually brought the two back together, and Donald Blake discovered the stick, at which point he turned back into Thor, and the stick turned back into Mjolnir. Then he became a superhero, joined the Avengers, all that stuff, and over the subsequent years regained all of his memory and became a true Asgardian once more. The Donald Blake identity would not immediately vanish after Thor got Mjolnir back, though. Even once he regained his knowledge of his past, Thor chose to stay on Earth, both because he liked protecting Midgard, and also because he had fallen in love with Jane Foster and wanted to remain by her side. Since he chose to stay on Earth, the transformation enchantment kept affecting him for way longer than you might think. Thor remained Donald Blake for 20 real-world years, and during that whole time, it was more of a curse than anything else. His transformation was fundamentally tied to Mjolnir, and that left it as his greatest weakness. This is where we get into the first important power mechanic for Bill's story down the line. Thor could transform between his two states at will. All he would need to do is strike Mjolnir on the ground, and then both he and Mjolnir would turn into their god and hammer or mortal and stick forms respectively. The human Donald Blake had an easy excuse to keep the stick with him, as that form had an injured leg and required a cane to walk properly. So he just carried Mjolnir in disguise, using it as a walking stick, which nobody questioned. The issue with this, though, is that if he was ever separated from his walking stick, no way to turn into Thor. And the even bigger side of this issue is that back in this era, the Thor transformation was temporary. Thor had to keep Mjolnir in his hand to remain empowered. He could throw it and it would come back, of course, but every time that hammer left his grip, a countdown would begin. And if Thor went 60 seconds without physically touching Mjolnir, he would revert back to Donald Blake, and then couldn't transform again until he found wherever the stick ended up. So that's Mjolnir's first big catch to keep in your mind, and it is the one that is less relevant in the modern day. At least in terms of, that's a whole nother can of worms. The other thing we need to go over is, unsurprisingly, the Worthiest enchantment. Again, we're probably all familiar with this at a base level. Whosoever holds this hammer, if he be worthy, shall possess the power of Thor. Simple on the surface, but whenever you bring this up, you can really quickly dive into some big philosophical questions on how exactly you define worthiness for things like this. This has been handled in a lot of different ways by a lot of different writers, as the topic is a complex moral dilemma without a clear-cut answer. But I'm here to answer the tough questions and give you all of the deep lore, so here we go. This is Sir Superhero's objectively true and correct guide to what makes somebody a good and worthy person. Just kidding. I'm not gonna do that. Yeah, how exactly worthiness is defined and categorized, it's complicated and I'm not going to touch it with a 10-foot pole. Here's the great news though, for purposes of today's video, I don't really have to, because remember, this is not an in-depth history of Mjolnir, this is Mjolnir as it stood 50 years ago. And weirdly, back in Thor's original status, the worthiness enchantment didn't really matter, actually. More recent interpretations of Thor's origin have set this up as a character journey where he needs to improve himself and eventually become worthy of reclaiming Mjolnir, but that's not really what the original intent was. Donald Blake didn't remember being Thor, he did not remember that he needed to go get his hammer. Hell, when he actually finds it and picks it up for the first time, he can just use all the powers immediately. Mjolnir was not something that Thor was striving for over his initial arcs. The Worthiness enchantment was basically a security measure that Odin put on the hammer so that only Thor could use it. It was more than anything else just part of Thor's power set. He had a magic weapon that nobody else could actually lift, and that was a cool thing that he could do. End of story, it really was that simple. The Worthiness angle was just a way to make that flow better with the writing and magical tone. Given the context that worthiness is not plot relevant, I actually can define worthiness for our purposes very easily. If you are worthy, that means that you are extremely kind and noble and heroic. Of course, with the added information that this is in the context of a superhero comic, so there's extra emphasis on protecting the innocent and all that stuff. A bit anticlimactic, perhaps, but with that covered, you know everything about Mjolnir that you need to for this. So, 8 minutes into the video, we can finally start talking about Beta Ray Bill. And to that end, we are going to go very far away from both Earth and Asgard to an area of the Marvel Universe called the Burning Galaxy. Which, just to get this out of the way before people comment it, yes, with the way it's drawn and described, it's definitely a solar system, not a galaxy, but whatever, I can't do anything about that. Orbiting the central star of the Burning Galaxy, we find a planet called Corbin, home to an alien species called the Corbinites. The Corbinites are peaceful and advanced, boasting impressive technology and a thriving civilization. All is well for them, and then the sun explodes. As is guessable from the name, the sun at the core of the Burning Galaxy was extremely hot, and this heat made it a target for the fire giant Surtur. In ancient times, Surtur had wielded a weapon called the Twilight Sword, which was the blade prophesied to bring about Ragnarok. However, the blade had been shattered before this destiny could be fulfilled. To set his plans back on track, Surtur needed to reforge the Twilight Sword, and the Burning Galaxy provided the necessary temperatures. Then, surprise surprise, a fire giant forging an apocalypse blade in the center of your sun turns out to be pretty bad for any nearby planets, and Corbin is entirely obliterated during the burst of flame. Fortunately for the Corbinites, they had detected Surtur's approach in advance, and while there was nothing they could do to save their planet, they could at least escape. And so the entire civilization of Corbin piled themselves into cryopods aboard a fleet of warships and set out into the universe looking for a new homeworld. They did not do this in safety, though. Surtur had brought with him an army of fire demons, and as the Corbinites fled, these demons pursued them across the stars. Expecting that this was going to happen, though, the Corbinites had prepared a countermeasure. A guardian, one person, the pinnacle of Corbinite technology, who would defend them in their ageless journey. And this was Beta Ray Bill. Many warriors applied for the duty of Corbinite champion, but Bill was the one who prevailed, and his reward came in the form of superpowers. Corbinite technology was incredibly advanced, and Bill was infused with all sorts of cybernetic technology that increased his strength, stamina, and durability to incredible levels. That is not where his augmentation ended, though. There is a whole other side to it, and this is where we get the first really interesting piece of Beta Ray Bill lore. You've all seen Bill by this point. He's a horseman. He looks kind of weird, but he's an alien, whatever. Here's the thing, though. Some of you might have picked this up if you're paying very close attention to the panels that I've been showing you, but the other Corbinites, they don't look like that. A standard Corbinite face is pretty humanoid. Not exactly the same, they don't have noses, but the shape is the same. They don't have those elongated horse-like features. The reason that Bill looks like this is that part of his process of getting superpowers included genetic modification. Bill's DNA has been fused with that of a creature called a Tuog, which was an apex predator on Corbin. This has also increased his physical capabilities and provided another angle in addition to the cybernetics, but as a side effect of that, it also made him look like a Tuog, which to the Corbinite people especially was monstrous. I'm going to take a guess here and even assume that those of you who had seen Beta Ray Bill in passing didn't know this part of his lore, because it is very easy to write off. Again, he's an alien. Aliens can look like that, whatever. But Beta Ray Bill's appearance is truly unique. He is the only guy that looks like that, and he is, by his people's standards, extremely disfigured. This is where we get to see the first inklings of worthiness in Beta Ray Bill's storyline, because he volunteered to protect his people, knowing that it would turn him into a monster in the process. And the comics do not shy away from this angle. There is a flashback scene where we see Bill look at his new appearance for the first time and break down in tears at seeing the thing he's been turned into. Yeah, some of you guys thought that he was just the funny alien horse Thor, huh? No, Bill is a very deep and fleshed out character. Bill did not have long to consider his decisions, though, because Surtur was fast approaching and the Corbinite fleet needed to set off. Bill was put into cryosleep with the rest of his kind, but whenever fire demons got too close to the fleet, he would awaken, fight off the attackers, and then return to the pod. After a while, by pure coincidence, the Corbinites started getting a little bit close to Earth, and S.H.I.E.L.D. picked up the large army of alien warships that were heading in their direction. Concerned about this, Nick Fury asked Thor if he could quickly fly out there and investigate, and the Asgardian agreed. You might think it's a little bit risky to send Thor out on a space mission when he still has the whole needs to keep the hammer or he turns into a normal guy debuff, but don't worry, that really only affected him on Earth. If he was out doing something else, he could remain as Thor for longer. And I'm sure that's not going to be a problem at all. So, hammer in hand, Thor flies up to the Corbinite flagship, which also happens to be Beta Ray Bill's personal ship, known as the Scuttlebutt. The Scuttlebutt then immediately flags Thor as a threat. They don't know what an Asgardian is. The Corbinites are from way far out in space, so Asgard isn't really something they know. But they know that a magic guy is rapidly approaching, so they detect him as a demon and the defenses activate, which of course includes Bill himself. Abracadabra, we have the classic superhero trope where two good guys have each mistakenly identified the other one as bad, and especially since both Thor and Bill are the hit first, questions later type, they immediately start fighting. Thor and Beta Ray Bill are pretty evenly matched here. Thor does definitely have the upper hand, but that's largely because of Mjolnir. In terms of pure physicality, they are equals, so their fight is long and violent enough that the scuttlebutt takes some internal damage. This causes an autopilot to kick in, turning the scuttlebutt towards the nearest habitable planet, which happens to be Earth. Since Thor is way out in space, where he thinks he is out of the enchantment range, he's not really paying that much attention to Mjolnir. He's just focused on the fight. And eventually, the scuttlebutt gets close enough to Earth that the enchantment kicks in. And since Thor has not been holding Mjolnir, he just turns into Donald Blake right there. Now that his opponent is just like a dude, Bill knocks him out in a single hit. He's very confused by the whole thing. Literally, his next line is, "I do not understand the demon's transformation, but it would be unwise to question such a gift horse too closely." So Bill says, "I don't know what the hell just happened, but I'm not going to argue with it. Now let's try to not crash the ship." This begins a pattern that I think is very fun with Beta Ray Bill's characterization, which is that in contrast to his appearance, he is a pretty normal and down-to-earth man. Bill is good in a crisis and is usually going to respond in a very reasonable and practical way. If something goes right, he's just going to take that in stride and then move on to the next thing. He immediately gets a chance to prove this again, as when he barely lands the scuttlebutt on Earth, he is immediately surrounded by a bunch of S.H.I.E.L.D. agents, who were the ones that detected his approach in the first place. Bill still thinks that they are demons though, and now he's surrounded, but then he has an idea. Continuing the streak of him being a very practical combatant, he remembers, hey, that guy that I just beat seemed to be wielding a pretty cool magic hammer. I'm gonna take that. He quickly looks around for it, finds where the hammer would have fallen, and in its place he sees a stick, because of course Mjolnir transformed back when Thor did, not that Bill is aware of this. He picks it up just to be sure that it is in fact a stick. It is, and then in a fit of rage, he tries to shatter the stick along a nearby wall. And in doing so, he slams the stick and turns into Thor. He looks down, he's cosplaying Thor now, and he has Thunder God powers. Does Beta Ray Bill have any idea what on earth is going on? No, not a clue. But he's gonna go 3 for 3 with this. If Beta Ray Bill is gonna do one thing, it's work with what he has. He has new powers? Let's just go and fight some demons. He starts smashing up S.H.I.E.L.D. tanks left and right, and would probably have won this fight were it not interrupted by Odin. As this whole thing was going on, Odin had become aware of the Surtur and Twilight Sword situation, and wanted to call Thor back to Asgard as soon as possible so that he could send someone to go deal with it. And since he had called Thor back to Asgard many times, I guess he was just doing it on instinct. So he sought out the power of Thor, and then pulled that back. And Thor didn't have the power of Thor at the time, so he grabbed Bill by accident. So Bill's in Asgard now, meaning that for the 4th time in the last, maybe 15 or 20 minutes, he is in a situation where he has no idea what is happening. Yet he is still undeterred, and he instantly chunks Mjolnir directly at Odin's face. Odin just grabs Mjolnir out of the air, of course. He helped make the thing, so he has control over it, and then he finally processes something is very wrong here. Odin then calls the actual Thor to Asgard as well, turning him back to Thor form in the process, and they begin working out what on earth was going on. Because while this might seem kind of straightforward now, with the context of decades of Thor comics, this was a very weird thing at the time. Bill first debuted in Thor issue 337 in 1983, and despite the very high number of issues here, this was the first case of anyone other than Thor actually being able to use Mjolnir, and it is such a surprise that even Odin wasn't really expecting it. Odin says very clearly, quote, "Little did I dream that one other than my son would ever be worthy of this terrible power. Yet someone is, and here we sit in this dilemma." So now everyone is confused. Thor is confused and mad because he got beaten and now somebody else has his hammer. Odin's confused because he apparently never considered this was a possibility. And Beta Ray Bill is confused because of literally everything that's going on. The obvious solution comes first, which is that Odin asks Bill to return the hammer, and Bill says no. Remember, Bill was woken up by his ship's auto defenses, and he still thinks all these people are demons. So from his perspective, he beat a guy that attacked him first, claimed the cool hammer, and he's now won that thing in fair combat. He's not giving it back. Adding another layer of confusion to this, Bill's motivation for wanting to keep Mjolnir actually isn't selfish. While explaining his situation to Odin, he tells the Asgardian about the Corbinites, and very plainly says that Mjolnir may be a weapon that can protect his people from the demonic threat. He doesn't just want to keep this hammer because it will make him strong, this can help him fulfill his duty. So now Odin is in quite a bind. Before him stand two warriors, both of whom wish to use Mjolnir to protect their respective civilizations, and the magic on Mjolnir solidly proves that both of them are fundamentally good at heart. Additionally, Asgard is a warrior culture, and so since Bill did technically beat Thor, that is something that Odin is also going to consider. Thus, given all of these factors, he decides that the only way to determine Mjolnir's true rightful wielder is by a contest. Thor and Bill are going to have a 1v1 brawl for the hammer, and Mjolnir itself is not going to be wielded by either of them for this. No Thunder God powers are going to be in play. Odin disables those on both fighters. It is just Thor's might and skill as an Asgardian versus Bill's might and skill as the Corbinite champion. Oh, and the fight is also to the death. If it seems insane that Odin would send his son to possibly die over this incident, don't worry about that. There's more happening below the surface. Odin is doing something kind of clever here. But for now, yeah, they are dueling. All that is left is for Odin to pick the location of the battle, and he chooses a realm called Skartheim. And now, this comic is literally the only time that the word Skartheim has appeared anywhere, so I can't tell you a lot about it, but I will note that it is a volcanic region, which is actually a very important detail for how this battle is going to go. Once they arrive in Skartheim, Thor and Bill begin their brawl, and Bill actually wins, defeating Thor and claiming the right to Mjolnir for himself. That, in theory, answers the question of who of these is the stronger fighter, as last time Thor only lost because of the Donald Blake weakness, and that wasn't in play here. However, this fight wasn't fair either, because Odin rigged it in Bill's favor. Remember, Beta Ray Bill is native to a place called the Burning Galaxy, which is obviously incredibly hot. His species on Corbin evolved to be perfectly fine in that level of heat, and Odin sent these warriors to a volcanic region. Even here, the pair are evenly matched enough that they fight each other to a standstill, and the battle ends with them both crumpled on the ground above a river of lava. But the heat is draining to Thor's stamina, and on the other side of things, being in a river of lava is like a day at the beach for Beta Ray Bill. The refreshing heat gives the Corbinite just enough energy to stand, and with that, the battle is won. Thor is not dead yet, but they are standing on a chunk of rock heading towards a lava fall. Bill doesn't even have to deal the final blow. He can simply leave, and the lava will finish Thor off. But in that moment, that is not what Bill decides to do. Instead, at great risk to himself, he picks his opponent up and carries him to safety. You then might be able to pick up where exactly this was going. This challenge was not really about which one of them is the better fighter. Odin wanted to test Bill's worthiness in another way. He wanted to watch Bill win and then see how he handled it. Thor was never actually in any real danger here. Had Bill really left the Asgardian to die, Odin would have intervened and rescued him. I mean, I assume so. That is not actually explicitly stated on the page, but the alternative is that Odin willingly sent them into a situation where Thor was set up to die, so I don't think that was the case. Regardless of that, once the battle is complete, Odin recalls the fighters to Asgard and gets them each medical attention. And as he recovers, Bill continues to be just the most chill guy in the galaxy, because even here, he acknowledges that he didn't technically win. He has a whole conversation with Odin while he is lying in a hospital bed, and during this he acknowledges that while the Corbinites really need a power like this, it would be wrong of him to take Mjolnir from Thor. Plus, the challenge, as far as he knows it, was to kill the opponent, and by rescuing Thor, he didn't do that, therefore he is not the victor by the rules laid out. At this point, Bill has also realized that the Asgardians are not evil, let alone the demons that he was fighting previously, and acknowledging Odin as a wise ruler, he asks the Asgardian king for his advice on this difficult situation. And Odin's response is essentially, "Don't worry, you've done everything right." Beta Ray Bill has clearly proven himself to be a confident and capable fighter. He wants the hammer for the safety of his people, not his own personal gain. Even with that context, at the end of his brawl with Thor, he chose to save Thor's life at great risk to himself, and on top of all that, he's now asking Odin for help, proving that he's humble enough to seek counsel when he needs it. All of these things put together mean that he is clearly worthy. Of course, the problem still remains that Bill being worthy of Mjolnir doesn't mean that Thor suddenly isn't anymore. Thor's had a horrible time in this storyline. He hasn't had a real fight with Bill in the whole arc. He loses the first one because of the Donald Blake curse, and he loses the second one because of unfair home field advantage. This has just sucked for him. Fear not, though, because Odin has a solution for this too. He can make another hammer. That might seem a little bit wild given the context of Thor in the present day, but remember that back in the 80s when this storyline happened, Thor had been around for about 20 years and something like this situation had never happened before. There weren't a lot of questions about who was worthy to wield the hammer or not. No one else can wield it. Bill was the first guy to come around with that ability, so he was a very special case. Thus, Mjolnir would be returned to Thor, and Bill and Odin would go on to forge a new mystical weapon, one with a different visual appearance, but the same abilities. When wielding his new hammer, Bill would gain all the powers of Thor, and thus his hammer was christened Stormbreaker. A brief aside for people who are more familiar with the MCU than the comics. Yeah, the MCU Stormbreaker is a very different thing. Thor has wielded an axe in the comics as well, but in the comics, the axe is called Jarnbjorn. And I guess Marvel Studios decided that they didn't want two very Norse names for his weapons, and so in the movies, they just called his axe Stormbreaker instead. In the comics, Stormbreaker is Beta Ray Bill's hammer and just that. So now there's two people with the power of Thor running around. It was a complicated problem, two people being worthy, and they solved it with the easiest solution in the world: just have two hammers. But what of Thor in all this? Beta Ray Bill has his powers, but again, this whole arc has just kind of sucked for Thor. How's he feeling right now? He has every right to be annoyed. Thor's day began with him getting beaten up, and then ended with him getting beaten up a second time, and now the guy who beat him up twice is getting rewarded with a hammer that is just as cool and strong as Mjolnir is. Thor might be really mad about this. But if you think Thor is really mad here, just take a second and consider Thor's personality, 'cause he's not mad at all. After getting Stormbreaker, Bill immediately goes to leave so that he can handle the demon problem, and upon hearing that, Thor's instant response is, "Oh, you're gonna go fight demons and save people? Awesome, I'm coming too, let's go." Thor and Beta Ray Bill are battle buddies immediately. Literally the page after Bill gets Stormbreaker for the first time, there's a shot of them both shouting, "Nothing shall stand against us," and then dramatically slamming their hammers together and flying off to fight demons. And that's not even the end of the scene, it gets better. See, Bill is not going back to the Corbinite fleet immediately, he's actually going back to the burning galaxy. It is too late to save Corbin, the planet is gone, but Surtur's big apocalypse blade left a portal to his realm in the sun, and more demons are coming out of it constantly. Unless they can close that portal, the Corbinites are going to be hounded by demons forever, so Bill wants to go take it out at the source. The problem with this is that the burning galaxy is really far away. Regardless of whether it's a solar system or a full galaxy, it is definitely outside of the main Marvel galaxy, and Bill's ship, the Scuttlebutt, is going to take a while to get there. Bill kind of starts prepping Thor for this. He's like, hey, we can take my ship, but the journey's gonna be long, we're going to need provisions, etc. And Thor's response is, oh, don't worry about that. I have a magic chariot with magic space goats. We can just take that and be there almost immediately. And then he calls Tooth Gnasher and Tooth Grinder, and they fly off to the Burning Galaxy, and that's the end of the first Beta Ray Bill arc. So this ends after Thor's gotten beaten up multiple times, with him essentially just saying, oh, you're gonna go be a hero? Cool, I'm coming too, and we can take my ride because it's faster. Look, say what you want about the Taika Waititi MCU Thor movies. Thor Love and Thunder did jump the shark by a very long distance. That one's not great. But Thor Ragnarok especially, it did get the comics characterization of Thor pretty accurate. That really is what Thor is like in a lot of his books. Now, I did say that was the end of the first Beta Ray Bill arc. That's technically not accurate because there is one more issue that's directly relevant. We do get to see Bill and Thor in the Burning Galaxy fighting demons. Lady Sif also comes along because I guess she just wanted to fight demons too. And yeah, they do what they set out to. They have a bunch of cool double hammer fight moments and they do close the demon portal. This issue is Thor 340, and it is a big one not just for Beta Ray Bill, but for Thor in general. I called a lot of attention to Donald Blake and the specifics of how that worked towards the beginning of this video. This is the other reason why I did that. Bill remains with the Corbinites for a while after this, but he does return to Asgard with Thor briefly so that he can thank Odin for everything. And when that happens, Odin modifies the enchantments on both Mjolnir and Stormbreaker. Stormbreaker gains an enchantment very similar to the one that Thor used to turn into Donald Blake. By striking the hammer on the ground, Bill can change it into a normal stick, and also turn himself into a normal Corbinite. This removes his augmentations, letting him not be a monster anymore, but also letting him regain his power whenever he wants, as a reward for his heroism. Granted, this does kind of get removed later. Unfortunately, Bill does go back to just being a monster permanently in future books. But there was at least a time when he got to lead a normal life. What adds another layer to this, though, is the way that Odin put this enchantment onto Stormbreaker, because he transferred the enchantment from Mjolnir directly. That means that Mjolnir and Thor no longer had the Donald Blake curse. From issue 340 onwards, Thor would no longer turn into Blake under any circumstances, willing or otherwise. The secret identity was completely removed. I guess this whole incident coming out of the Donald Blake thing going wrong proved to Odin that it wasn't necessary anymore. That means that not only is this arc the first time someone other than Thor wielded Mjolnir, it is also the official end of the secret identity Thor era. Thor 340 really is a milestone in this character's history over all 60 years of it. This was not the end of Beta Ray Bill's saga either, because, well, people liked him, and for good reason. He would continue being a recurring character for the next couple of decades in a few different comics. Unsurprisingly, his most common book to appear in was Thor. He was briefly a part of the Thor Corps, which was a group of 3 different hammer wielders, Bill himself, a Thor from a future timeline, and then Eric Masterson, who was the wielder of the actual main Mjolnir at a time when Thor was not handling it. Beyond his Asgardian connections, writers would also lean into Bill's alien nature and occasionally put him in other space and cosmic books. He was in an Adam Warlock series, Rom the Space Knight for one issue, and my personal favorite, a very short-lived comic called Star Masters, which had a roster that consisted of Beta Ray Bill, Silver Surfer, and Quasar. And my god, what I would give to read, or hell, even write a new version of that series in the modern day, oh my god. Bill's next major appearance wouldn't be until 2005, but he would come back to this in a very big way by starring in his own solo miniseries called Stormbreaker, the Saga of Beta Ray Bill. Stormbreaker adds a lot to Beta Ray Bill's lore, not just by expanding on Bill individually, but also by adding more information to Corbin. This series establishes that in the midpoint between his previous arcs and 2005, the Corbinites had found and established a new home planet, simply called New Corbin. Bill had continued being their protector, but he also had other duties elsewhere in space, primarily with Asgard. He would go back to them and help out his newer allies with Ragnarok events and various other issues. And, it turns out that Corbin was pretty unhappy with the fact that their chosen champion was two-timing them. This kind of sounds silly at first, but when you think about it, yeah, it does actually make a lot of sense. Opinions on Bill among his people were extremely divided. A lot of the population loved him, almost revered him even, as the hero who did successfully lead them to a new home. But the Corbinite leadership was less favorable. The High Council of New Corbin did not love the fact that people were bypassing them in favor of a warrior that was supposed to be under the council's command, much less so given that said warrior had also sworn allegiance to Asgard, and Bill's loyalty was about to be tested as New Corbin faced another cosmic threat. This weird-looking space thing was an entity that the Corbinites referred to as Ashta. It was a planet devourer, and if the idea of planet devouring combined with this thing's color scheme and design elements seems a little bit familiar, that is not a coincidence. Ashta is Galactus. They are one and the same. A fun little bit of Galactus lore in this largely unrelated video, Galactus appears differently to different species. He is a cosmic force, and he's not always a humanoid. He has some weird psychic cosmic thing going on, so people perceive him in ways that they could understand. And for whatever reason, in the Corbinite consciousness, Galactus appears like this. As Ashta Galactus, whichever name you want to use, both are correct, approached New Corbin, Beta Ray Bill was not present, and fearing that their champion would not get back in time to save them, the Corbinite Council deployed another champion they had created, actually one before Beta Ray Bill, named Alpha Ray Bill. Yes, there is an Alpha Ray Bill, and no, he is not a joke character. Technically, I do think his name is just Alpha Ray. I don't think they ever actually call him Bill as well, but whatever, it's funnier that way. Though, as I say that out loud, I realize that his lack of a proper name may actually be intentional given his lore. Alpha Ray is not technically a modified Corbinite, at least not in the same way that Bill is. Instead, he is an artificial creation. Alpha Ray was the Council's first attempt at a Corbinite champion, way back when they were trying to deal with Surtur. Rather than modifying one of their own into an enhanced warrior, they first tried to just make a biomechanical warrior from scratch. Alpha Ray was what they came up with, and while he was an incredible fighter, he lacked a certain something. For lack of a better term, let's call it a soul. Alpha Ray was a capable warrior, but he could only follow commands. This being was not capable of independent thought. He would adhere to his programming, but that's it, meaning that he didn't function well in unexpected situations. This made him too dangerous, so the Council shut down the program and instead looked at augmentation, which is how we ended up with Beta Ray. And yeah, that seemed incredibly successful, as we've seen Bill work great in unexpected situations time and time again. The Council did keep Alpha Ray around, though, in case of emergency, and Galactus was one such emergency, so they let him loose. Bill did actually make it back in time as well, though, and so this meant that Corbin had a pretty good defense. They had their entire fleet, an augmented super warrior, and then another warrior who is, for all intents and purposes, a very powerful Asgardian. That could have gone great, except the Corbinite priesthood screwed it all up. Since the ruling priesthood was angry that the population was beginning to revere Bill over them, they had programmed Alpha Ray to see Bill as an opponent. And because Alpha Ray is only capable of adhering to his programming and not prioritizing in unique situations, this meant that he attacked Bill as Galactus was also advancing on the planet. This threw off their entire defense, and Galactus was successful, meaning that he devoured New Corbin and its population entirely, the second destruction of Bill's home. This is a very cool setup. I mean, it's a tragic setup for Bill especially, but it could lead to some good storytelling. And then Stormbreaker ends in a really weird way that doesn't matter much going forward, so I'm kind of going to speedrun the rest of this. Some of the Corbinites do survive Galactus's assault, as a few ships manage to escape, and the rest of them get their consciousnesses absorbed into this thing called the Meta Orb, so that basically the Corbinite species can live on in a new way somewhere else. I guess after the destruction of their first homeworld, they put in more failsafes. And then the Meta Orb gets infected by a great old one named Astaroth, and Astaroth uses the consciousnesses of the Corbinites to incarnate into a new form called Omega Ray, which is like a Beta Ray Bill type guy, but a demon, and then Bill sacrifices himself to defeat Omega Ray and gets reincarnated into a human on Earth. And then Bill is just a human for a bit. He takes on the name Simon Walters, and he's in a few arcs in the Simon Walters state. He's in a book called Omega Flight, which is a Canadian super team thing, and then he ends up sacrificing himself and going to hell where he fights monsters for all eternity, and then he's just back to normal. So that's why I did the speed run. Yeah, after a weird arc with the destruction of New Corbin and Alpha Ray and Omega Ray, and then Bill just becoming a guy, his next appearance is in the Secret Invasion event, and he's just back to normal. He's just a Corbinite again. I don't think it's ever actually explained how he got back to normal, but I'm not going to argue with it, especially because immediately after this, they follow up on the Galactus killing New Corbin storyline, and that arc is a way better continuation. So you can just kind of skip the last minute and a half. The last half of the Stormbreaker series doesn't really exist or matter, and Bill's next good appearance would be in the Beta Ray Bill God Hunter miniseries, and this one's pretty cool. God Hunter focuses on Beta Ray Bill looking for revenge. Galactus has destroyed his homeworld. Not even his original, but his new homeworld. Most of his people are dead, and he is not going to let that happen again. Beta Ray Bill is going to kill Galactus. But he also can't kill Galactus, not in the traditional sense. Strong as he is not powerful enough to just murder a cosmic being. So he comes up with another plan, and a much darker one at that. This series shows Beta Ray Bill following the trail of Galactus's herald at the time of being named Stardust, and destroying the planets in Galactus's wake before the Devourer can feed on them. Bill is going to kill Galactus by starving him to death. This doesn't mean that Bill has gone full villain. He is giving the people of the planets warning so that they can evacuate before Galactus gets there. And after all, even if Bill doesn't destroy the planet himself, Galactus will, so the outcome's going to be the same. But that thinking is a slippery slope. Bill's single-minded desire to starve Galactus leads him to do crazier and crazier things. At one point, he encounters a civilization who refuses to leave their homeworld, so he infects them with a plague and then promises them the cure, but only if they evacuate, essentially blackmailing them into, on the one hand, saving their own lives, but on the other hand, wow, that's a wild solution. I do love this concept for a series. The idea of someone trying to starve Galactus is a very cool one, and it's especially cool in the context of it being Bill who has to do it. Because as Bill does more and more unethical things, he starts to lose his ability to pick up Stormbreaker. Eventually, he becomes so wholly unworthy that he loses all of his Thor powers entirely and reverts to his previous state. And in this moment, he is forced to confront the thing that he has become and turns from his path of vengeance, regaining the powers of Thor once again. It is a short little series, only 3 issues, but, I mean, if you consider it the actually good follow-up to the Stormbreaker miniseries that doesn't just turn into random weird demon things, then it's a little bit longer. Once the God Hunter arc concluded, Bill returned to his status quo of being a frequent recurring character, but rarely in the spotlight. Bill appears for an issue or two in a lot of Thor and cosmic arcs like Guardians of the Galaxy series, but he is rarely the star focus. He is a cult classic secondary character, and it is always quite good to see him appear, but since then, he has had one major starring role. In the beginning arcs of the Thor series by Donny Cates, Thor becomes a herald of Galactus. And now he does so willingly, that's a whole complicated thing outside the scope of this video, but Bill, having very bad history with Galactus, is understandably outraged at Thor for what he sees as a betrayal. They end up fighting, and in the chaos of this, Thor smashes Stormbreaker. This was done out of a fit of rage, not true villainy, and Thor does attempt to repay his old friend for his mistake by giving him access to all the weapons of Asgard in return. Of course, none of these carry with them Stormbreaker's enchantment, and this leaves Bill in an unfortunate situation. I mentioned earlier that Bill had the ability to change into a humanoid Corbinite form at will thanks to Odin's enchantment on Stormbreaker. He had gained and lost this power over the years in various books, but at this time he did definitely have it. At least he had it until he lost Stormbreaker, which meant that now he was stuck in his monstrous form permanently once again. This leads to perhaps the saddest scene in Beta Ray Bill history. See, Bill had always been very close with Lady Sif. She had accompanied him and Thor on their first mission to the Burning Galaxy, and they had gotten closer ever since. But their relationship had never become intimate until this book. In the aftermath of a big Asgardian victory against the forces of Null, god of the symbiotes, Sif and Bill go to the bedroom to, and in that moment, Sif asks Bill how, quote, this works, referring to him changing back into a less monstrous, more humanoid form, which she thought he had the ability to do, and he is no longer capable of. Sif had seen Bill's natural Corbinite form before, and was evidently physically attracted to it enough, but less so to his more animalistic, disfigured state. And when she realizes that he can no longer change back, there is a moment of hesitation. She tries to be nice about this, but Bill picks up on it, and as he looks at his monstrous face in the mirror, he says, "Sif, please, I understand. I am not blind." And then he leaves. Poor Bill, man, he deserves better than this, but for all the tragedy, this does lead to a really, really good Beta Ray Bill miniseries called Argent Star by Daniel Warren Johnson. This book is fantastic. It's all about Bill striking out on his own away from Asgard in an attempt to reclaim a form that he is not horrified by, and it rules. This book released in 2021, and I'm not going to give you a detailed plot summary on it for a couple of reasons. First off, even though it is a few years old, it is Bill's most recent solo series, and I try not to cover the most recent appearances of characters for a variety of reasons. But the other and more important reason in this case is that this Beta Ray Bill series is a really good introductory comic, actually. This would be a great one for people who are wanting to get into reading comics themselves, and that is one of the big goals of this channel. I do want people to actually read the stuff, not just watch my videos. This comic is really accessible, it is a tight 5 issues, and you don't really need any other information to jump right in. If you've watched this far in this video, you know everything you need to understand Beta Ray Bill Argent Star. You know Bill's history, you know how his powers work. I should remind everybody of something I mentioned earlier, that he has a spaceship called the Scuttlebutt. That's very important in this comic. Scuttlebutt is a delight. Teasers aside, it is a fantastic series, I highly recommend it, and trust me, the experience of actually reading the comic is better than listening to a YouTuber talk about it, so go check it out. Now, even though I did say that was his most recent solo, the video's not quite over yet because there is one more thing I need to cover. One very important but very weird thing about Bill's status quo in the modern day, and that is that right now in currently releasing comics, Beta Ray Bill is Thor. He doesn't have the powers of Thor, he's not metaphorically Thor, Beta Ray Bill is literally Thor. This is going to be a wild thing to drop right at the conclusion of this, but this is the only way that I can put it simply. In currently releasing Marvel books, Asgard isn't real. I don't mean it was destroyed, I don't mean it doesn't exist, I mean it isn't real. That is the most literal way I can put it. The events of the comic Immortal Thor by Al Ewing led to Asgard essentially being turned into fiction. The stories of the Asgardian gods are just that, stories, and they always have been. The people of Asgard are still around, but they're around in a very different capacity. There's a lot of weird meta-narrative magic stuff going on that would take way too long to explain here. Point is, the Asgardians have been wiped from history. They have been rewritten. This is not going to be a permanent thing. They're going to come back at some point soon. This arc is very much still ongoing. But Thor is not real, and to the people of the Marvel Universe, he has never been real. He has always just been a story, a myth from ancient times. But that doesn't really work with the history of the Marvel Universe. Thor is a clear and present guy, so somehow those discrepancies have to be accounted for. Thus, in the weird magic reality warp that turned the Asgardians into fiction, Beta Ray Bill was reality warped into being Thor. His history has been altered so that everything Thor did, Beta Ray Bill did instead. The founding members of the Avengers, yeah, they don't have Thor the Asgardian, but they do have Beta Ray Bill, the alien with a magic hammer. Now, granted, we haven't seen like a comic of this. There have not been books focusing on Beta Ray Bill with his new history. It is something that has been mentioned in passing as the comics deal with Thor and Loki and those other characters in their new altered state. But regardless, it is canon right now. Reality gets warped to erase Thor, and to fill in that gap, it slots Beta Ray Bill into his place. Now, as I just said, this is a currently ongoing arc, so I can't tell you where exactly it's going to end up, because it hasn't ended up anywhere yet. Technically, I probably shouldn't even cover this because of the whole don't cover the most recent stuff rule, but screw it, that's just such a wild place for Bill to be in currently that I had to bring it up quickly. It also sets me up very nicely for a conclusion, where in a single character video, I typically talk about whether I think the character is going to be more or less relevant in the coming years, and in Bill's case, yeah, he's going to be relevant. He's literally Thor. He has been reality warped to Thor's entire history. Is that going to last? No, but it's definitely going to go somewhere. And you know what? He deserves every bit of spotlight that he gets because Beta Ray Bill is awesome. I'm going to be very transparent about the reason I did this video today. I got a cold because I was at a Comic-Con and I couldn't record for a while and I was getting annoyed and antsy. So I decided to do a Beta Ray Bill video because it's impossible to be annoyed when talking about him. He's just so cool. He's such a fun case because he's cool on the surface and then just gets cooler the more you learn about him. When you first see him, you're like, oh, alien horse Thor, that's weird, I'm on board for it. Then you learn the history about him being the first person besides Thor to wield Mjolnir. That's awesome, I love that storyline too. Then you get all his backstory about being disfigured for the cause of protecting his people, and you learn that he has a great emotional core to his arc. It just never stops getting better. It's so easy to assume that Beta Ray Bill is a joke from first impression, and he's not. He's not at all. Beta Ray Bill is an excellent parallel to Thor because they both approach worthiness from different directions. Thor's origin, especially in more recent interpretations, is about approaching worthiness from above. He is powerful, he is arrogant, he sees himself as above everybody else, and he has to learn humility. He has to bring himself down to the level of others, and that's how he becomes worthy. But Bill is coming at it from the bottom. Bill has destroyed himself for the sake of worthiness. He was willing to be turned into a monster to protect his people, and he has gone through hardship after hardship in that cause. But because they are both heroes at their core, they arrive at the same conclusion. These two characters prove very nicely the simplicity of worthiness. Mjolnir reads, "Whosoever wields this hammer, if he be worthy, shall possess the power of Thor. Be that human, Asgardian, or Corbinite, it doesn't matter what you did to get there. If you're worthy, that hammer is yours, and you have damn well earned it." Thank you all so much for watching. I do hope you enjoyed. I don't have much to say to conclude this video other than Beta Ray Bill, hell yeah. I mean, how could you come out of watching this entire video not liking Beta Ray Bill? I think your heart must be made of stone if you don't think this guy rules. I'll keep announcements quick. As always, I have a Patreon. If you go and check that out, you can find early and ad-free access to all of my videos, as well as a Patreon exclusive video every month. There are over 5 hours of backlog videos on there and counting. My username there is the exact same as it is here. There's also a link in the description of this video and on my channel page. It's very easy to find. And extra double thank you to everyone who already supports me over there. It really does help me keep making these videos for you guys. Also, shout out to Ruben Perez, the artist I work with for these videos. He drew the poses of the character that you've been watching talk at you for the last hour or so. Go check out his other work if you have a chance. And now at the end of the video, I'm going to do something that I might end up regretting and put out a call to the freaks among you, which I do mean as a term of endearment. Look, Lady Sif might not have been into Beta Ray Bill's more monstrous appearance, which is fine, that's her right, but I also know how the internet works, and I know there are definitely some people watching who would not turn Bill away for being unable to change back into his normal state. So for those of you out there, if you are among them, you know exactly who I mean. Let's get some polite and respectful and most importantly PG-13 love for Beta Ray Bill in the comments. I want to know how many of you are out there. God, I really might end up regretting this, but video engagement is engagement, I guess.